The courthouse hallway smelled like old wood polish and desperation. 7-year-old Emma sat rigidly on a wooden bench, her small feet dangling above the cold linoleum floor, not quite touching the ground. Her mother held her hand, but Emma's palm was clammy and cold, making her mother adjust her grip every few seconds, not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough to convey that she wasn't going anywhere. Emma's other hand clutched a threadbare stuffed rabbit named Flopsy, her constant companion since she was 3 years old. The rabbit had faded pink fur and one eye hanging by a thread, but it was the only thing that still felt real in a world that had become increasingly surreal and nightmarish. It had been 7 months since everything changed. 7 months since the night that Emma's childhood died and her body became a battlefield. She didn't fully understand what had happened to her, not really. Her therapist, Dr. Collins, used careful words like inappropriate touching and body boundaries. But Emma knew the truth in her bones. Something sacred had been stolen from her, something she could never get back. The person responsible, a man named Richard Foster who had worked as a handyman at her school, had threatened her into silence with words that still echoed in her nightmares. "If you tell anyone," he'd whispered, his breath hot against her neck, "they'll take you away from your mommy. You'll never see her again." For months, Emma had carried the secret like a stone in her stomach, growing heavier every single day. She'd stopped sleeping through the night. She'd stopped playing with her friends at recess. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had noticed the change immediately, how Emma's bright personality had dimmed to a pale shadow of itself. She'd started wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since kindergarten. She would flinch when anyone touched her, even her mother's gentle hugs feeling dangerous and overwhelming. Her appetite had vanished, and her mother spent hours trying to coax her into eating, offering her favorite foods that Emma could barely taste. Then came the day everything exploded. It was a Thursday afternoon when Emma had finally broken, unable to carry the burden alone anymore. She'd been sitting in her mother's lap, trembling uncontrollably, and the words had tumbled out between violent sobs. The truth, finally released into the world like a bird escaping a cage. Her mother's face had gone white, then red, then something Emma had never seen before, a primal fury mixed with heartbreak. Within hours, the police were involved. Then came the interviews with specialized investigators who worked with children. Then came the psychologists and the social workers and the victim advocates who all tried to help Emma prepare for this single terrifying moment. Now, sitting outside the courtroom at 8:47 in the morning, Emma's entire body vibrated with a fear so profound it seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her stomach churned violently, and she'd already thrown up twice that morning despite eating nothing. The fluorescent lights above hummed with an irritating frequency that made her temples ache. Other people walked past, lawyers in expensive suits, court officers with badges and radios, curious spectators. And Emma wanted to shrink into herself, to become invisible, to simply cease to exist. Her mother, Jennifer, kept squeezing her hand and whispering words meant to be comforting. "You're so brave, sweetheart. You're the bravest girl I know." But Emma didn't feel brave. She felt like a small, fragile animal caught in a predator's trap, waiting for the jaws to snap closed. Her psychologist had warned her mother about this exact moment, had explained that some children in Emma's situation experienced a regression of trauma symptoms before testimony, that the anxiety could be completely overwhelming, that there was a real risk of Emma shutting down emotionally and being unable to speak in the courtroom at all. Emma's voice had already become so quiet over the past 7 months that sometimes people had to ask her to repeat herself 3 or 4 times. She'd become an expert at communication through silence, through the language of her trembling hands and her distant eyes. How could she possibly stand in front of all those people, the judge, the lawyers, the jury, the man who'd hurt her, and put her unspeakable experience into words? How could she describe something so dark, so shameful, so deeply wrong in the clinical language of a courtroom? A victim advocate named Ms. Patricia approached them, carrying a folder and a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knelt down to Emma's level, her knees cracking slightly. "Are you ready for a little walk, Emma? I want to show you the courtroom so there won't be any surprises inside. Sometimes when we know what to expect, it feels less scary." Emma shook her head wordlessly, pressing her face against her mother's arm. Ms. Patricia didn't push. She'd worked with hundreds of traumatized children, and she understood that sometimes compassion looked like patience, like giving a child space to breathe even when time was running out. The morning stretched on interminably. A clock on the wall ticked away seconds that felt like years. Emma's mother had taken the entire week off work, something she could barely afford as a single mother working as a nurse, to be present for this trial. Her job was on thin ice anyway. Her employer had been growing impatient with her absences for doctor appointments and therapy sessions and court preparations. But Jennifer would have lost her job 1,000 times over if it meant being present for her daughter through this nightmare. "The important thing to remember," Ms. Patricia had said during one of the preparation sessions, "is that you're not responsible for the outcome. Your only job is to tell the truth about what happened. The judge and jury will decide what to do with that truth. You're not responsible for punishing him or protecting other children or any of that. You just have to be honest." But Emma felt the weight of the world on her small shoulders anyway. She understood, in the intuitive way children understand such things, that her words would determine whether the man who'd hurt her went to prison or walked free. What if she forgot something important? What if she said the wrong thing? What if no one believed her? What if she was blamed for his actions, as he'd suggested she would be? The courtroom doors stood at the far end of the hallway, solid oak doors with frosted glass panels. Behind those doors awaited her nightmare made tangible. Behind those doors sat the person who'd stolen her innocence, who'd shattered her sense of safety, who taught her that the world was fundamentally dangerous and that her body was not her own. Emma's hands trembled so violently that her mother had to help her hold Flopsy. Every cell in her small body screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear. But she was 7 years old and she had nowhere to go. The clock on the wall showed 8:59. In 1 minute everything would change. 3 months earlier, before the courthouse hallway and the terrifying morning that awaited her, Emma sat in Dr. Collins's office with her arms wrapped around her knees. The psychologist's office was designed to be comforting: soft pastel walls, shelves lined with stuffed animals, a carpet with geometric patterns meant to be soothing. But Emma found no comfort anywhere anymore. She'd been coming to these sessions twice a week for 5 weeks, and while Dr. Collins was kind and patient, nothing seemed to help. The nightmares still came. The fear still seized her without warning. The shame still burned through her chest like acid. Dr. Collins was a woman in her 50s with gray streaking through her dark hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd specialized in childhood trauma for nearly 3 decades, and she'd seen the devastating aftermath of abuse reflected in countless young faces. But each child's pain was unique, and Emma's particular wound ran especially deep. The girl had completely withdrawn into herself, speaking only when absolutely necessary, her voice barely above a whisper even when she did speak. "Emma," Dr. Collins said gently, "I'd like to try something different today. I have a friend I'd like you to meet. Is that okay?" Emma didn't respond, which was typical. She simply stared at a spot on the carpet, her jaw clenched tight. Dr. Collins stood and walked to the door. Emma heard her say something to someone in the hallway, and then there was the distinctive sound of nails clicking against the hardwood floor. A dog appeared in the doorway. He was large, perhaps 75 pounds, with a coat the color of honey and wheat fields in summer. A golden retriever, with a face so gentle it seemed impossible that anything could be threatening about him. His eyes were warm and brown, and they held an expression of complete and utter peace. The dog wore a blue vest with the words "Certified Therapy Animal" embroidered in white letters. Emma's head snapped up immediately, her eyes widening. This was the first genuine reaction Dr. Collins had seen from her in weeks. "This is Max," Dr. Collins said softly, settling back into her chair. "He's a very special dog. He's not here to do tricks or fetch balls. He's just here to be. Would you like to meet him?" Max walked into the room with an unhurried gait, his tail wagging slowly. He didn't approach Emma directly. Instead, he positioned himself on the carpet about 3 feet away from her and simply lay down, resting his chin on his front paws. His dark eyes remained on Emma, but his posture was completely non-threatening. He was, in every way possible, saying, "I'm here and I'm safe, and there's no pressure." Emma stared at him for nearly 5 minutes without moving. Dr. Collins said nothing, allowing the silence to breathe naturally. She understood that sometimes in trauma work, the most powerful moments were the ones uncluttered by words. Slowly, tentatively, Emma uncurled herself from her protective ball. She didn't reach toward Max, but she did straighten her legs slightly. The movement was tiny, barely noticeable, but it was something. Max's tail thumped twice against the carpet, a gentle acknowledgement rather than an enthusiastic response. "Max understands something," Dr. Collins said quietly, "that most people don't. He understands that sometimes healing doesn't come from talking or thinking or processing. Sometimes healing comes from being in the presence of something that loves you exactly as you are, without judgment, without expectations, without demands." Another 5 minutes passed. Emma's breathing gradually slowed. The tension in her shoulders began to ease incrementally. Then, with a movement so slow it seemed almost underwater, Emma extended her arm toward Max. She didn't touch him yet. She was simply testing the waters, checking to see if she was safe. Max lifted his head slightly and shifted his body position to be closer to her, but he still didn't touch her. He was allowing Emma to dictate the pace of their interaction completely. This was masterful animal therapy. The dog understood that sometimes the most powerful gift you can give a traumatized person is the gift of control. Emma's fingers, which had been clenched in fists for so long they developed permanent calluses, slowly unfurled. She touched Max's fur tentatively, her fingertips barely grazing the soft golden strands. The moment her skin made contact with his coat, something shifted in her body. Her shoulders dropped about an inch. Her breathing deepened. Her eyes, which had been haunted and distant for months, seemed to focus on something present, something real, something good. "How does that feel?" Dr. Collins asked. Emma didn't answer, but she continued to touch Max's fur, her fingers becoming slightly less hesitant. After several minutes, she actually moved herself closer to the dog, not dramatically but noticeably. Max remained perfectly still, allowing her to approach him at her own pace. When Emma was finally close enough, she did something she hadn't done in months. She leaned against another living being. Her small body curled against Max's warmth, her face buried in his fur. Dr. Collins felt tears prickling behind her eyes. In her 30 years of work, she'd never seen anything quite like this. The transformation wasn't complete. Emma was still traumatized, still hurting, still broken. But in this moment, she was also safe. She was also held. She was also loved. Max remained completely still, allowing Emma to absorb all the comfort she needed. His breathing was steady and deep, and somehow his calm seemed to transfer to the child leaning against him. Minutes passed. Emma's breathing synchronized with Max's, and her rigid body gradually relaxed. When the session ended, Emma didn't want to let go of Max. Dr. Collins had to gently explain that Max had other people to visit, but that Emma could see him twice a week if she wanted to. The change in the girl's face was immediate and palpable. Twice a week. A lifeline. Over the following weeks, Emma and Max became inseparable during her therapy sessions. She would arrive at Dr. Collins's office and immediately ask about Max in her tiny whisper of a voice. The dog seemed to understand that this particular child needed him in ways other clients did not. Max would position himself exactly where Emma needed him, sometimes with his head in her lap, sometimes with his body supporting hers, sometimes simply lying beside her as she sat in silence. Through Max, Emma began to remember what unconditional love felt like. The dog never asked her to explain her trauma. He never required her to use words or relive her pain verbally. He simply accepted her, broken and wounded and silent, exactly as she was. More importantly, he allowed her to experience physical touch as something safe, something healing rather than something to fear. Dr. Collins began teaching Emma's mother about the therapeutic benefits of Max's presence. She explained how trauma literally lives in the body, how the nervous system becomes dysregulated, how a calm, breathing, living creature could help reset that system. Jennifer watched her daughter, who had become a ghost of her former self, slowly come back to life through the simple presence of a golden dog named Max. By the time the trial date was set, everyone involved in Emma's care had come to the same conclusion. If Emma was going to survive testimony in open court, if she was going to find the courage to speak about the unspeakable, she would need Max by her side. Max wasn't just a dog anymore. He was her lifeline to hope. The witness preparation room was small and windowless, painted a pale shade of beige that was supposed to be calming, but somehow felt imprisoning instead. Emma sat rigidly in a metal folding chair, her feet swinging slightly above the ground, her fingers twisted together in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The room smelled like cleaning supplies and stale coffee, and it felt like the walls were slowly closing in on her with each passing minute. Her mother sat beside her, still holding her hand, though Jennifer's grip had become almost painful in its intensity. She was terrified too, though she was trying desperately to hide it behind a facade of maternal strength. The morning had begun before dawn. Emma hadn't slept at all the night before. She'd simply lain in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her mother tossing and turning in the darkness of the master bedroom. Around 3 a.m, she'd heard her mother get up and go to the kitchen. Through the walls, she'd heard the sound of packing, back and forth, back and forth. Her mother was unraveling too, but she was trying so hard to hold it together for Emma's sake. They'd arrived at the courthouse by 7 o'clock, before most of the building was even awake. Ms. Patricia, the victim advocate, had met them in the parking lot with a warm smile that did little to ease Emma's mounting panic. The courthouse itself was a massive stone structure that looked more like a fortress than a place of justice. Gothic architecture, tall columns, imposing steps, everything about it seemed designed to intimidate and overwhelm. Now in the small preparation room, Max lay at Emma's feet, his warm body providing an anchor of stability in a sea of chaos. The dog seemed to sense the magnitude of what was about to happen. He hadn't left Emma's side all morning, and his usual tail-wagging enthusiasm had been replaced with a kind of focused attentiveness. Max knew this child in a way that transcended human understanding, and he was prepared to be her rock no matter what came next. Ms. Patricia sat across from them, reviewing the courtroom layout one more time. She had a laminated diagram that showed where everyone would be positioned. "Okay, Emma," she said gently, "let's talk through this again. The judge will be up here on this raised platform, sort of like a throne. Her name is Judge Margaret Richardson, and I've worked with her on many cases. She's very fair and she cares about child witnesses. She's going to make sure you're treated with respect." Emma stared at the diagram but didn't truly absorb any of it. Her anxiety had reached such a crescendo that her brain felt foggy and disconnected, as if she were observing all of this from outside her own body. "The jury," Ms. Patricia continued, pointing to the box on the left side of the diagram, "will be 12 people. Some men, some women. They're regular people, teachers, business owners, parents, and their job is to listen to your testimony and decide if the defendant is guilty. They're going to hear you, Emma, and they're going to believe you." But Emma couldn't imagine anyone believing her. How could she possibly explain something so horrible in front of 12 strangers? How could she describe what Richard Foster had done to her without vomiting, without completely falling apart, without feeling the crushing weight of shame that always accompanied memories of that night? "The prosecutor will ask you questions first," Ms. Patricia went on. "His name is Marcus Williams, and he's been handling your case for 3 months. You've met with him twice, do you remember? He's going to ask you gentle questions to help you tell your story. He wants the jury to understand what happened. Then the defense attorney, his name is Robert Chen, he's going to ask you more difficult questions. He's going to try to make you confused or make you doubt yourself. That's his job. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means he has to do his job, which is to defend his client. Emma's mother squeezed her hand harder. Jennifer had met with Marcus Williams multiple times, and she trusted him. But the idea of a defense attorney trying to make her daughter doubt herself, trying to poke holes in her testimony, trying to make her look like she was lying, it filled Jennifer with a rage so profound she had to take several deep breaths to keep from screaming. "And where will he be?" Emma whispered, her voice so quiet that Ms. Patricia had to lean forward to hear. "The defendant will be sitting at the defense table," Ms. Patricia said, meeting Emma's eyes with compassion. "He has to be in the courtroom, but there are court officers there, and if you need anything, if you need a break, if you need to ask for water, you just raise your hand and tell the judge. The judge will protect you." Emma wasn't convinced. She'd read about trials in stories, and she knew that sometimes guilty people walked free because of technicalities or because they had good lawyers. What if that happened to her? What if she testified and Richard Foster was found not guilty anyway? What if he was released and he found her and he hurt her again? A knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. A court officer poked his head in. "We're about ready to begin. They're bringing the defendant into the courtroom now." Emma's heart stopped. He was here. Richard Foster was somewhere in this building, in this very courthouse. The man who destroyed her world. The man she'd been too terrified to name for months. The man who'd stolen her safety and her childhood and her sense of self. He was close enough that she could conceivably run into him in a hallway. The knowledge made her dizzy. Max sat up immediately, his body tensing. The dog looked at Emma's face, seeming to assess her emotional state, and then pressed his entire body against her leg. The pressure was grounding, exactly what Emma needed. She reached down and buried her fingers in Max's fur, holding onto him like he was her only lifeline. "I can't do this," Emma whispered. "I can't, I'm going to throw up, I can't go in there." Her mother's eyes welled with tears. She wanted to pull her daughter out of this, wanted to protect her from all of it, wanted to go back in time and prevent any of this from happening in the first place. But they couldn't go back. They could only move forward. "You don't have to be strong, baby," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "You just have to be honest. That's all. Just tell the truth. The rest will take care of itself." But Emma wasn't sure she believed that. She'd learned long ago that the truth didn't always protect you. Sometimes the truth put you in danger. Sometimes the truth made adults angry. Sometimes the truth meant that no one would ever love you the same way again. Ms. Patricia checked her watch. "It's time, Emma. Are you ready?" Emma looked down at Max, whose eyes held such unwavering loyalty and love that she felt something shift inside her chest. If Max could be brave, if Max could face the unknown with such calm acceptance, then maybe she could too. Maybe together they could survive this. She took a shaky breath and stood up on trembling legs. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'm ready." But she wasn't ready. She would never be ready for what came next. And yet she stood anyway. The courtroom doors swung open, and Emma stepped through into what felt like another dimension entirely. The space was larger than she'd anticipated, with high ceilings that made her feel impossibly small. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that floated in the air like tiny ghosts. The courtroom was already packed. Journalists sitting in the gallery with notepads and cameras, curious spectators occupying nearly every seat, court officers positioned strategically around the room. All of those eyes turned toward Emma as she entered, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force pressing against her small body. Max remained at her side, his vest identifying him as an official therapy animal. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, nodded in acknowledgement as Emma and Max approached. Judge Margaret Richardson's face was kind, but her expression was serious. This was a grave matter, and even her gentle demeanor couldn't disguise that fact. Emma's legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Her vision had started to blur around the edges, a symptom of the panic attack that was building in her chest. She could feel her heart rate accelerating, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The courtroom seemed to tilt slightly, and she gripped Max's collar to steady herself. "Good morning, Emma," Judge Richardson said warmly. "I'm Judge Margaret Richardson. I want you to know that this is a safe space for you to tell the truth. Do you understand?" Emma nodded wordlessly. She couldn't make her voice work. It had disappeared somewhere deep inside her, locked away in the same vault where she kept all her trauma. The bailiff stepped forward. "Please raise your right hand and place your left hand on the Bible." Emma did as instructed, her small hand trembling visibly. Max remained beside her, creating a physical barrier between her and the rest of the room. The dog's presence was the only thing keeping her grounded in this moment. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the bailiff intoned. "I do," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silent courtroom. She climbed into the witness stand, which seemed enormous and exposed. There was no hiding here. She was elevated above everyone, like a specimen under glass, and every eye in the room was fixed upon her. Max was allowed to remain at the base of the stand, close enough for Emma to see him, close enough that she could reach down and touch him if she needed to. Marcus Williams, the prosecutor, approached with a warm smile. He'd worked with Emma twice before, and he knew her triggers, her fears, her limitations. He began gently, asking her to state her name and age. Emma managed to answer these basic questions, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Can you speak a little louder, please?" Judge Richardson asked kindly. "The jury needs to hear you." Emma nodded and tried to repeat her answers in a slightly stronger voice, though it still shook with terror. Marcus continued with gentle questions about her school, her family, her routines. These were warm-up questions designed to help Emma feel comfortable speaking. Slowly, incrementally, her responses became slightly more audible. The prosecutor was masterful in his approach, never pushing too hard, allowing Emma to dictate the pace. Then the questions became more serious. "Emma, I want to ask you about something that happened on March 15th. Do you remember that night?" Emma's entire body went rigid. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness stand so tightly her knuckles turned white. That night, that horrible, dark night that had changed everything. She could see it in perfect, crystalline detail, could smell the cleaning supply closet where it had happened, could feel the terror that had paralyzed her body, could hear the threatening words that had kept her silent for so long. "Yes," she whispered. "Can you tell the jury what happened that night?" Emma opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The words were stuck somewhere in her throat, caught behind an impossible knot of shame and fear and trauma. She could feel everyone watching her, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to expose what had been done to her body. "It's okay, Emma," Marcus said gently. "Take your time." But Emma couldn't find the words. How did you describe violation? How did you put horror into language? How did you explain to 12 strangers exactly what Richard Foster's hands had done to your body? She reached down and touched Max's soft fur, and the dog pressed his head against the stand, offering her whatever strength he could provide through that physical connection. Slowly, painfully, Emma began to speak. Her voice was barely audible, and Judge Richardson had to remind the court reporter to get closer. Emma described how Richard Foster had been doing work in her school, how he'd asked her to help him find something in the storage closet, how he'd locked the door, how his hands had moved across her body in ways that had felt wrong and terrifying and impossible to stop. As she spoke, Emma could feel herself emotionally fragmenting. The words felt disconnected from her body, as if someone else was speaking them while she watched from a distance. Her therapist had warned her about this: dissociation, the mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable trauma. Then the cross-examination began. Robert Chen, the defense attorney, approached with a demeanor that was professionally aggressive but carefully calibrated not to appear openly hostile. Still, Emma felt the shift immediately. This man didn't believe her, or he believed her but was determined to make the jury doubt her testimony. "Miss Emma," he began, and something about the formal address felt condescending. "Isn't it true that you waited nearly 7 months before telling anyone about this alleged incident?" "I was scared," Emma whispered. "Scared of what exactly? Scared that you'd made a mistake? Scared that you were confused about what happened?" "No, Emma's voice cracked. "He said he'd take me away from my mommy." "But you're a smart girl, aren't you, Emma? Didn't you know that was just something an adult was saying to try to scare you? Didn't you understand that adults can't actually do that?" Emma felt the ground shifting beneath her. The attorney was making her second-guess herself, making her wonder if she'd misunderstood, if she'd overreacted, if somehow this was her fault. Tears began streaming down her face. "When exactly did this happen? Was it morning, afternoon? Can you describe the lighting?" Emma couldn't remember details like that. She remembered the feeling of being trapped, the overwhelming terror, the sense that her body was no longer hers. But specific details about lighting and timing, they dissolved in her mind like watercolor in rain. I don't remember exactly," she stammered. "You don't remember? Isn't it funny how the details are so fuzzy about something so supposedly traumatic?" Emma's hand started shaking violently. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She was hyperventilating, her body responding to the perceived threat, even though the danger in this moment was purely emotional. Every question felt like an attack. Every suggestion that she was confused or mistaken felt like an accusation of lying. She looked down at Max, and the dog's eyes were fixed on her with such unwavering compassion that it broke something open inside her. Max believed her. Max knew the truth about her. And in this moment, that unconditional belief was the only thing keeping her from completely shattering. But she was shattering anyway, piece by piece, her testimony becoming more fragmented, her voice becoming more inaudible, her panic becoming more visible to everyone in the courtroom. The defense attorney continued his assault of questions, and Emma felt herself drowning in a sea of doubt and fear and shame. She was losing. And she knew it. Retrie the questions came relentlessly, each one a hammer blow against Emma's fragile mental state. Robert Chen's voice maintained a tone of polite skepticism, but his words were designed to demolish her credibility piece by piece. Emma's grip on consciousness was slipping away, replaced by a fog of panic and dissociation that made everything feel dreamlike and unreal. "Isn't it possible, Miss Emma, that you misunderstood the intentions of Mr. Foster? After all, you're only 7 years old. Children often misinterpret adult behavior, don't they?" Emma shook her head, but the movement was weak, unconvincing. Her voice had become so quiet that the court reporter had to ask her to repeat herself multiple times. With each repetition, her words sounded less credible, less certain, less true, even though nothing had changed about the reality of what had happened to her. "When you told your mother about this incident," Chen continued, consulting his notes with theatrical precision, "what were her exact words? Can you recall them verbatim?" Emma couldn't recall them verbatim. Her mind was a jumble of fragmented memories and emotional trauma. She remembered the sensation of her mother's arms around her, remembered the feeling of finally being believed, but the specific dialogue, it was lost in the fog of her damaged psyche. I don't exactly remember what she said." "You don't remember, but you remember every detail of Mr. Foster's alleged actions." It was a trap, and Emma had walked right into it. The attorney was establishing a pattern. She remembered things when they were convenient, when they made the defendant look guilty, but conveniently forgot details that might suggest she was confused or lying. The jury would notice this inconsistency. Emma could see some of them leaning back in their chairs, their expressions shifting from sympathy to skepticism. Her mother sat rigidly in the gallery, her hands clenched into fists so tight that her nails were drawing blood from her palms. Jennifer wanted to jump up and scream at the attorney to stop, to protect her daughter from this psychological assault, but she was powerless. The system didn't allow mothers to protect their children from the legal machinery designed to determine truth. Jennifer could only watch as her daughter was systematically destroyed on the witness stand. "Now, when you say Mr. Foster touched you inappropriately," Chen pressed on, "can you describe exactly where he touched you? Can you point to your body and show the jury?" This was a devastating question. Emma was asked to publicly identify the parts of her body that had been violated. The shame that erupted inside her was overwhelming. She felt her face burning red as she quietly pointed to her upper leg, her voice dissolving into an inaudible whisper. Several jurors looked away, uncomfortable with the child's obvious distress. "I'm sorry, could you speak up? The jury can't hear you." "My leg," Emma managed to say slightly louder, "and my chest." "Which chest area exactly? Upper chest, lower chest, can you be more specific?" Each question required Emma to relive the assault in excruciating detail while describing it to a room full of strangers. The trauma wasn't something that happened in the past. It was happening right now, in real time, in front of an audience. Emma's body began to shake uncontrollably, her small frame racked with tremors that were visible to everyone in the courtroom. Judge Richardson leaned forward, concern etched into her features. "Mr. Chen, I think we should take a break. The witness is clearly distressed." "Just a few more questions, Your Honor," Chen interrupted smoothly. "I'm almost finished." The judge hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The rules of court allowed the defense attorney to continue his cross-examination, even though it was clear that the witness was emotionally collapsing. "You mentioned that Mr. Foster threatened you, correct? That he said he would take you away from your mother if you told anyone." "Yes," Emma whispered. "Did he actually say those exact words, or are you paraphrasing? Because it's important that we know exactly what he said." He said if I told, they would take me away from my mommy." "They? Who is they?" I don't know, he just said they would." "So you don't actually know who they refers to? Isn't it possible that you've confused this memory? That over time, the details have become distorted in your mind?" Emma's breathing had become rapid and panicked. She was hyperventilating now, her small chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. Tears streamed down her face, and her entire body convulsed with silent sobs. She looked down at Max, desperately searching for an anchor, but even the dog's presence wasn't enough to keep her from drowning in the sea of panic that was consuming her. "I'm not confused," Emma said, her voice cracking. "I know what happened, I know." "How can you be certain?" Chen pressed relentlessly. "How can you be absolutely certain that your memory is accurate when you can't even remember basic details like what your mother said or who they refers to?" The courtroom had gone deathly silent. Even the journalists had stopped writing, captivated by the tragic unfolding of a child's complete emotional devastation. Emma had begun to visibly shake so violently that she could barely hold onto the edge of the witness stand. Her eyes had taken on a glassy, distant quality that suggested she was barely present in her own body. Ms. Patricia stood up in the gallery, her face pale with alarm. This was going too far. The cross-examination had crossed the line from aggressive questioning into psychological abuse of a child. But there was nothing she could do within the framework of the legal system that governed this courtroom. "I object to the line of questioning, Your Honor," Marcus Williams said, rising to his feet. "The witness is clearly unable to continue. The defense is attempting to confuse and intimidate." "Overruled," Judge Richardson said, her own voice tight with tension. "The defense has the right to cross-examine. Mr. Chen, please proceed, but let's try to wrap this up." Emma felt something inside her beginning to crack irreparably. The shame, the fear, the sense of helplessness. It was all converging into a black hole that was pulling her consciousness away from this place, away from this courtroom, away from her own traumatized body. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to cease to exist. She wanted to go back in time and never tell anyone what Richard Foster had done to her, because at least then she wouldn't have to endure this public dissection of her trauma. "Just one more question," Chen said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Is it possible that you've fabricated or exaggerated these memories in order to get attention from your mother? Children sometimes do that, don't they?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine's blade. Emma felt something fundamental break inside her. The attorney was suggesting that she had lied, that she had made this up, that her trauma was nothing more than attention-seeking behavior. The implication was devastating. Not only had Richard Foster violated her body, but now the legal system was violating her testimony, her truth, her very identity. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her voice had completely abandoned her. She was mute, frozen, completely disconnected from her body. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness stand so tightly that her fingernails began to break against the wood. The room started to spin. The fluorescent lights seemed impossibly bright, burning into her retinas. The faces in the gallery blurred into indistinguishable shapes. Emma's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She was losing. The perpetrator was going to walk free because she couldn't hold it together. She couldn't articulate her trauma in the precise, unemotional language the legal system demanded. Her terror was being interpreted as uncertainty. Her fragmentation was being framed as dishonesty. Everything was falling apart, and she was powerless to stop it. Emma looked down at Max, and for the first time she raised her hand, not to answer a question, but in a gesture of complete and utter desperation. She was signaling for help. She was calling out into the void, hoping that someone, anyone, would save her from the drowning sensation that was pulling her under. The courtroom held its breath. And then something extraordinary happened. The gesture was subtle. Emma's small hand raised slightly, not in response to the attorney's question, but as a silent plea for help. It was the signal she and Dr. Collins had practiced during her therapy sessions, the physical manifestation of emotional overwhelm that indicated she needed intervention. Max had been trained to recognize this exact gesture. He understood it not as a command, but as a cry of distress from the child he had bonded with over these past months. What happened next would forever change the trajectory of the trial and the lives of everyone present in that courtroom. Max stood up in one fluid, graceful motion. His chest expanded as he drew a deep breath, and his muscles tensed with focused purpose. This wasn't the lazy movement of a dog stretching after a nap. This was deliberate action driven by instinct and training, and something even deeper, the profound connection between a traumatized child and an animal who understood her pain on a cellular level. The courtroom froze. Every eye shifted from Emma to the golden retriever. Even Robert Chen paused mid-thought, his mouth closing abruptly as he registered the unexpected movement. Security officers began to move forward, ready to intervene, but something in Judge Richardson's expression stopped them. The judge's eyes had widened with what appeared to be recognition of something extraordinary unfolding. Max walked across the courtroom with unhurried deliberation. His nails clicked against the hardwood floor in a rhythmic pattern that seemed to echo through the silent space. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the journalists, trained to capture every dramatic moment, sat frozen, sensing that they were witnessing something that transcended the normal mechanics of a courtroom proceeding. The dog approached the witness stand where Emma sat trembling, her small body racked with sobs that had become silent, the kind of deep, primal crying that comes from a place beyond words or sound. Max placed his front paws on the edge of the witness stand, hoisting his considerable body upward so that his face was level with Emma's. His warm brown eyes met her tear-filled gaze directly, and in that moment, a connection formed that seemed to exist outside the normal dimensions of time and space. Emma's arms moved almost involuntarily. She wrapped them around Max's neck, burying her face in his soft golden fur. The physical contact seemed to trigger something fundamental in her nervous system. Her body, which had been trembling violently, began to gradually settle. Her breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, started to slow and deepen. She held onto Max as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had become liquid and unstable. The courtroom remained completely silent. No one moved. No one dared to interrupt this moment. One of the journalists had tears streaming down her face, her pen frozen midair above her notepad. A juror in the back row removed her glasses and pressed her palm against her eyes. The court reporter's hands had stilled on the keyboard. Even Robert Chen, the defense attorney, stood motionless, his expression transformed from aggressive skepticism into something resembling awe. Judge Richardson's stern judicial expression had softened into something almost vulnerable. She was witnessing an extraordinary moment of emotional authenticity that transcended all the legal posturing and cross-examination tactics that normally governed her courtroom. This wasn't about procedure or technicality anymore. This was about a wounded child and the unconditional love of an animal who refused to abandon her in her moment of deepest despair. Minutes passed. Emma remained buried in Max's fur, her hands gripping the dog's neck. Max didn't move. He didn't shift his weight or try to pull away. He simply remained perfectly still, allowing the traumatized child to absorb all the comfort and stability that his presence could provide. His breathing was steady and deep, and Emma's breathing gradually synchronized with his, the biological phenomenon of co-regulation occurring naturally between human and animal. Ms. Patricia, the victim advocate, had stood up in the gallery, her hand covering her mouth. She had never seen anything quite like this in her years of working with trauma survivors. The therapeutic mechanism Max was providing in this moment was something that couldn't be replicated by any human, no matter how well-trained or compassionate. The dog was offering something beyond words, beyond explanation, beyond the reach of the legal system's attempts to deconstruct truth into fragments and inconsistencies. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Emma finally pulled back slightly from Max's fur. She kept her arms around his neck but lifted her face from his chest. Her eyes were swollen and red from crying, her cheeks stained with tears, but something fundamental had shifted in her expression. The panic was gone. The dissociation had receded. She was present again, grounded again, connected again. She looked directly at Max, and the dog gave her face a gentle lick, not enthusiastically or playfully, but with the careful tenderness of a creature acknowledging profound vulnerability. Emma managed something that resembled a smile, small and fragile but genuinely present. Judge Richardson cleared her throat. Her voice, when she spoke, carried an emotional undertone that suggested she was deeply moved by what had just occurred. "I think we should take a break," she said quietly. "A substantial break. This court will reconvene in 1 hour." She didn't look at Robert Chen or Marcus Williams or any of the court officials. Her gaze remained fixed on Emma and Max, as if she couldn't quite tear her attention away from the profound humanity of what was unfolding before her. As officers began to clear the courtroom, Emma kept her arms around Max's neck. The dog remained at the witness stand, his body language conveying that he would stay as long as Emma needed him. A female court officer approached cautiously, as if afraid of disturbing something sacred. "Do you need anything, sweetie?" she asked Emma gently. Emma shook her head but didn't release Max. The dog was her lifeline, her anchor, her proof that something believed in her unconditionally. Jennifer rushed from the gallery toward her daughter, but she stopped short of the witness stand, sensing that Emma needed Max more than she needed her mother in this moment. Instead, Jennifer placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder, and the three of them, mother, daughter, and faithful dog, formed a triangle of love and support that transcended the legal machinery attempting to determine truth. The journalists who had been freed from the courtroom immediately began writing their stories. Therapy dog's intervention halts cross-examination in abuse case. Golden Retriever comforts child witness during traumatic testimony. The images they had captured would go viral on social media within hours, touching the hearts of thousands of people who would read about this extraordinary moment. But for Emma, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Max had answered her call. What mattered was that in her moment of deepest despair, when the legal system had seemed determined to destroy her credibility and her testimony, this golden dog had stood up and said without words, "I believe you. I see you. I love you exactly as you are." Marcus Williams approached slowly, respectfully. "Emma, how are you feeling? Do you think you can continue?" Emma didn't answer immediately. She rested her forehead against Max's, her eyes closed, drawing strength from his presence. Then slowly, she opened her eyes and looked at the prosecutor. There was something different about her now. The panic had been replaced by something else. Not confidence exactly, but something deeper. A kind of grounded certainty that came from being truly seen and truly loved. "Yes," she whispered, "I can keep going." And everyone in that courtroom knew, with absolute certainty, that something had fundamentally changed. Emma was no longer alone. The courtroom doors reopened exactly 1 hour later. The break had allowed Emma time to center herself, to drink water, to use the bathroom without the crushing weight of 100 eyes upon her. But more importantly, it had allowed her to sit with Max, to feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, to remember that she wasn't alone in this fight. Her mother had brought her a juice box and some crackers, and though Emma's stomach remained twisted in knots, she managed to consume a little sustenance. The small act of nourishing her body seemed to help settle her nervous system incrementally. As Emma walked back into the courtroom, everything felt different. The space that had seemed impossibly large and threatening now felt merely large. Max remained at her side, his presence a constant reassurance that transcended the legal proceedings happening around them. The gallery was even more packed than before. Word had spread through the courthouse about the extraordinary moment that had occurred, and people were curious to witness what would happen next. Emma climbed back into the witness stand, and this time her movements were slightly less hesitant. Max positioned himself at the base of the stand in the exact same spot, close enough that Emma could see him in her peripheral vision, close enough that she could reach down and touch his fur if she needed grounding. Judge Richardson nodded to Marcus Williams. "Prosecution, you may continue your direct examination." The prosecutor approached with evident care, his expression conveying that he understood the magnitude of what Emma had just endured. But he also seemed to sense something different about her now, a slight straightening of her spine, a marginally firmer set to her chin. The intervention of Max had somehow paradoxically made her stronger rather than weaker. "Emma, I know that was incredibly difficult," Marcus began gently, "but I need to ask you some more questions about what happened on March 15th. Are you ready?" Emma took a breath and nodded. When she spoke, her voice was barely louder than before, but something in its quality had changed. There was less trembling, less uncertainty. She sounded like someone speaking a truth she knew with absolute certainty, rather than someone doubting herself. "Yes," she said clearly, "I'm ready." Marcus guided her back through the events of that night, but this time, Emma's responses were different. She didn't shy away from difficult details. She described Richard Foster's actions with a clarity that seemed to come from some newly accessed place of courage. When asked about her feelings during the incident, she articulated them with a precision that made the jurors lean forward, engaged and believing. "How did Mr. Foster's actions make you feel?" Marcus asked gently. Emma paused, considering the question seriously. She reached down and touched Max's head, and the physical contact seemed to unlock something inside her. Scared, she said, her voice steady, and trapped, like my body wasn't mine anymore, like I couldn't say no and have anyone listen, and ashamed even though I knew it wasn't my fault. He made me feel like it was my fault. The raw honesty of her words hung in the air. Several jurors were visibly moved, some of them nodding slightly in recognition of the psychological truth she was articulating. Emma's testimony had transformed from fragmented and doubting into coherent and compelling. The change was striking. Marcus continued his questions, methodically building a narrative that was clear, persuasive, and deeply human. Emma answered each one with growing confidence. She wasn't performing or trying to convince anyone. She was simply telling the truth, and the truth, when delivered with such unvarnished honesty, carried its own power. When Marcus finally concluded his direct examination, he turned to Judge Richardson. "Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions." The entire gallery seemed to exhale. Many spectators had been holding their breath, invested now in this child's testimony and her journey toward healing and justice. Then Robert Chen stood to begin his cross-examination, and the tension in the room ratcheted up again immediately. But something fundamental had shifted. The defense attorney seemed to recognize it too. His aggressive posturing from before had been significantly tempered. He approached with the wariness of someone who had witnessed something he didn't fully understand, the extraordinary power of a child finding her voice through connection and love. "Miss Emma," he began, but his tone was notably less condescending than it had been before, "I'd like to go back to some of the details you mentioned. You said Mr. Foster took you to the storage closet. Can you describe what that space looked like?" Instead of shuddering as she had before, Emma actually described the closet with surprising detail. She mentioned the smell of cleaning supplies, the metal shelves, the dim lighting from a single small window. Her descriptions were specific and vivid, the kind of details that come from genuine memory rather than fabrication. "And you mentioned that he locked the door. How do you know it was locked?" "Because I tried to open it when he was done," Emma said matter-of-factly, "and it wouldn't open. I had to wait for him to unlock it from the outside." The specificity of this detail, the attempt to escape, seemed to strike a chord with the jury. Several jurors nodded slightly. This wasn't the vague recollection of a confused child. This was the precise memory of a traumatized one. Chen continued his questioning, but his line of attack had fundamentally changed. He was no longer trying to destroy her credibility through aggressive questioning. Instead, he was attempting a more subtle approach, asking clarifying questions that he hoped would reveal inconsistencies. But Emma's testimony remained consistent. The details she remembered clearly, she articulated with precision. The details she was uncertain about, she acknowledged honestly. "I don't remember exactly what time of day it was," she admitted when asked. "But I know it was after school because he was supposed to be fixing something that had broken during the day." This honesty about the limits of her memory actually reinforced her credibility. She wasn't claiming to remember everything perfectly. She was claiming to remember what mattered, the actions, the feelings, the violation, and that distinction was powerful. When Chen asked about her delay in reporting the abuse, Emma answered with devastating simplicity. "He said he would take me away from my mommy if I told, and I believed him. I was 7 years old and I believed that adults could do whatever they wanted and that no one would help me. So I didn't tell anyone for a long time. I was too scared." The answer was so honest, so psychologically true, that even Robert Chen seemed to accept it without further argument. He asked a few more clarifying questions, but the aggressive edge had completely left his voice. By the time he concluded his cross-examination, the dynamic in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. The jury had heard Emma's truth, and despite the defense attorney's best efforts to create doubt, the authenticity of her testimony had shown through. More importantly, they had witnessed her vulnerability, her courage, her willingness to describe the most traumatic experience of her life with unflinching honesty. As Emma stepped down from the witness stand, Judge Richardson spoke directly to her. "Emma, I want to commend you for your bravery today. What you did took tremendous courage. You should be very proud of yourself." Emma nodded quietly, but she wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at Max, whose tail was wagging slowly, whose eyes held that same unconditional love and acceptance that had sustained her through the most difficult day of her life. She walked toward Max and knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. The dog rested his chin on her shoulder, and for a moment nothing else mattered. Not the courtroom, not the jury, not the outcome of the trial. What mattered was this connection, this proof that she had survived, that she had been heard, that she had spoken her truth. As she held Max close, Emma made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened next in this courtroom, no matter what the jury decided, she had already won something infinitely more valuable. She had reclaimed her voice. She had reclaimed her power. She had reclaimed her right to be believed. And that was everything. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days that felt like 3 years to Emma and her mother. They returned to the courthouse each morning, and Emma would sit in the witness preparation room with Max, waiting to hear whether the 12 people who had listened to her testimony had believed her. The uncertainty was almost as agonizing as the cross-examination had been. What if they thought she was lying? What if they decided that reasonable doubt meant Richard Foster should go free? What if her testimony, despite everything, wasn't enough? On the morning of the 3rd day, a court officer appeared in the doorway with news. The jury had reached a verdict. Emma's heart began to race uncontrollably. Max, sensing her anxiety, pressed his entire body against her legs, grounding her in the present moment. Jennifer held her daughter's hand as they walked toward the courtroom once more. The gallery was packed even more densely than before. Word had spread about the therapy dog and the traumatized child, and the story had captured the public imagination. News cameras waited outside the courthouse. Social media was flooded with speculation about the outcome, but Emma tried not to think about any of that. She tried to focus only on Max, only on the steady rhythm of his breathing, only on the unconditional presence of the one being who had believed in her unconditionally. Judge Richardson entered and everyone rose. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, electric. The jury filed in and Emma watched their faces desperately, trying to read something, anything, that might indicate which way they had decided. But jurors were trained to remain neutral, their expressions carefully controlled. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Richardson asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman, an older man with kind eyes, responded. "On the charge of child sexual abuse, how do you find the defendant?" The courtroom held its collective breath. Emma felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. Every second stretched into an eternity. "Guilty," the foreman said clearly. The word hung in the air like a physical manifestation of truth. Emma's entire body went limp with relief. Around her, she heard gasps and murmurs. Her mother's hand squeezed her so tightly it almost hurt, but Jennifer was crying, tears of relief, tears of validation, tears of the nightmare finally coming to an end. Judge Richardson continued reading the verdict on the remaining charges. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word was a validation of Emma's courage, a confirmation that her truth mattered, that she had been believed. Emma looked down at Max, and the dog's tail was wagging gently. He seemed to understand, in his animal wisdom, that something significant had just occurred. He pressed his face against Emma's leg, and she ran her fingers through his soft golden fur, overwhelmed by emotion. As Richard Foster was led away by court officers, Emma felt something shift fundamentally inside her. The monster who had stolen her childhood, who had violated her body, who had filled her nights with nightmares and her days with terror, he was going to prison. He could hurt her no more. He could hurt other children no more. Justice had been served. In the weeks that followed, the trial concluded. Emma didn't attend the sentencing, but her mother did, and she returned with news. Richard Foster had been sentenced to 15 years in prison. 15 years to think about what he had done, 15 years to understand the devastation he had caused, 15 years removed from the world of children he had preyed upon. But for Emma, the true healing had already begun. She continued her therapy sessions with Dr. Collins, but something had changed. The therapy was no longer about trauma recovery in its rawest form. It had transformed into something more positive, building resilience, processing emotions, learning to trust again. And Max remained a central part of that process. Twice a week, Emma would sit in Dr. Collins's office with the golden retriever beside her, and together they would work through the complicated emotions that lingered in the aftermath of abuse and its public exposure. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. Journalists wanted to interview Emma, to photograph her, to tell her story to the world. But her mother had fiercely protected her privacy, allowing only a handful of carefully selected interviews that focused on the healing journey rather than the trauma itself. The images of Emma and Max from the courtroom had circulated widely, touching hearts across the country. People sent letters of support. Teachers reached out to her mother with stories of how Emma's courage had inspired them to report suspected abuse they had witnessed. The small girl's testimony had created ripples that extended far beyond her own case. But more importantly, Emma's life began to change in subtle, profound ways. She started playing again. Not constantly, not without occasional setbacks, but genuinely playing, laughing at jokes, engaging with her schoolmates, experiencing moments of pure childhood joy that had been stolen from her for so long. Her mother noticed that the nightmares came less frequently. When they did come, Emma had tools now: breathing exercises, coping strategies, and most importantly, the unconditional presence of Max, who would sleep at the foot of her bed on the nights when the nightmares were particularly severe. 6 months after the verdict, Dr. Collins approached Emma's mother with a proposal. She wanted to develop a formal courtroom therapy dog program based on Max's extraordinary success during Emma's trial. The intervention had been so profound, so transformative, that other traumatized children deserved the same opportunity for support and healing. Emma's mother agreed enthusiastically, and together with Dr. Collins and several other mental health professionals, they began the process of creating a comprehensive program. Emma became the face of the initiative, not in a way that exploited her, but in a way that honored her journey. She participated in promotional videos, always with Max at her side, explaining to other children who might have to testify about their own trauma that they didn't have to do it alone, that there were animals, humans, and systems in place to support them, that their voices mattered, that they would be believed. 1 year after the trial, on a sunny afternoon in May, Emma sat in her backyard with Max. She was 8 years old now, still small for her age, still carrying the invisible scars of her trauma, but also growing, healing, becoming. Max rested his head in her lap as she brushed his fur gently, their ritual from so many therapy sessions. "Thank you," Emma whispered to the dog, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking him for the courtroom intervention or for the daily presence, the unconditional love, the proof that the world still contained goodness and safety despite what had been done to her. Max's tail thumped against the grass, his response to everything: acceptance, love, presence. Emma's mother watched from the porch, tears of gratitude and relief streaming down her face. Her daughter would carry the marks of her trauma forever. There would be triggers, difficult anniversaries, moments when the past would suddenly feel present again. Healing wasn't linear, and recovery from childhood sexual abuse was a lifelong journey. But Emma was on that journey now, and she wasn't traveling it alone. The golden dog, who had simply answered a silent cry, had become so much more than a therapy animal. He had become a symbol of hope, a catalyst for systemic change, a living reminder that sometimes the most powerful interventions come not from complex psychological theories or legal maneuvering, but from the simple, profound act of showing up for someone in their darkest moment and refusing to leave. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma leaned against Max and closed her eyes. For the first time in over a year, she felt something she hadn't felt before her abuse: peace. Not the peace of forgetting, that would never come, but the peace of moving forward, of being believed, of being loved, of surviving. And beside her, Max remained constant, steady, present, a golden guardian who had helped a broken child find her way back to wholeness. The trial was over. The healing was just beginning. And it was enough. The end.